and democratic development of Africa's greatest nation. The example of development in freedom that democratic Nigeria is providing to the continent is a compelling one, especially in this era of renewed turbulence in Africa. I have to take also the opportunity to acknowledge the President of the former leader of the Republic of Sierra Leone, President Ernest Bai Koroma, who made important contributions to the development of ECOWAS during his tenure. Your Excellencies, I've had the privilege of reading the manuscript of a journey in service before the launch today. And I want to congratulate warmly General Babangida for giving us such a fascinating account of a critical time in the history of Nigeria. Luckily for all of us, even though it is quite a heavy book, it is an easy read, which will retain the interest not only of those of us who were alive during the times of the events recounted in the book, but also for those for whom it is very much history and folklore. As the General himself wrote in the very first sentence of the prologue, and I quote, "Over 3 decades have passed since the events described in the book," unquote. And I was ready to approach it as a history book in my frame of mind. There should not be many similarities, really, between the Nigeria of 1985 to 1992, with which the General grappled, and the Ghana of 2017 to 2025, where I have just finished being president after 2 successive terms. And even though 3 decades separate the 2 situations, it was interesting for me how often as I read the book, I came close to telling myself, plus ça change, plus ça reste la même chose. I lived through the years of regular coup d'etats and military coups, especially in our West African region. That did not make it any easier reading. The first-hand account of the man reputed to have been, and who admits to have been, part of all previous government changes faced while in charge. It is therefore reassuring that General Babangida can be so unambiguous in his support for democracy. He, after all, more than anyone, is best placed to pronounce on what some claim to be the advantages of military government, especially for developing nations in a hurry like us. He certainly demonstrates in his book that a military government indeed spends even more energy and resources on security considerations than an elected democratic one. Up till a few years ago, I would have said without any hesitation that after years of argument and experimentation, we have come to a consensus that multi-party democracy would be the most suitable form of governance structure for our continent, including West Africa. The regional grouping ECOWAS certainly thought that this consensus was accepted throughout its member states. And indeed, sanctions were spelled out for those countries that would succumb to military coup d'etats. I doubt that any of us was under any illusion that what we had all signed up to would be easy. But I was certain that all of us were ready to try to make it work. I feel a deep sense of disappointment. The military coup d'etats have come back in fashion in our region and are seen as the answer to the instability being spread from the Sahel by jihadist activity, and by some as the answer to difficult economic conditions or unpopular government policies. It would appear that we have our work cut out for us all over again to try to build and consolidate the democratic structures in our countries, to gain the confidence of our populations, especially to show that the road to prosperity would be faster and longer lasting when we are democratic. I'm not sure that back in 1985, when General Babangida became the leader of Nigeria, he and his colleagues had thought it out so clearly for themselves. But it would seem that somewhere along the line, or by the time it was over, as stated in the book, they had plans for a very brave new Nigeria. Permit me to quote him here, and forgive me for it is quite an extensive quote. There exists a world of difference between engineering a nation and ruling it. I never wished to rule Nigeria, and I never did it. My goal was to engineer it. The ultimate aim of engineering in the manner that we have attempted was precise. It was to chart a new course for a nation towards a new environment, consciously and carefully designed in anticipation of a future that can be understood, mastered, and managed. Engineering a nation is in reality in inventing the future. Everything has to be harnessed and focused. Human resources, material resources, and moral resources all must be brought into play. Over and above all, the nation's psychology must be redirected and refocused. That was the dream. The reality was a daily grind of trying to keep a country united and together, fighting off attempts at coup d'etats and violent disagreements about the terms of economic policies. If anyone needed reminding, this was the time that the International Monetary Fund got its reputation, or maybe we should say notoriety, for the terms that came with giving assistance to a country. This book reminds us that if a civilian constitutional government feels under constant threat of destabilization and having to spend far too much time and resources on security, a military government was under even more threat of insecurity. If the predictable problems of how to lift the bulk of the people from poverty and keep food prices down are overwhelming, they turn out to be far more tolerable when compared with the unpredictable things that hit a government in our part of the world. It is a difficult and exhausting process to come up with a plausible and workable foreign policy for an African country today. It was a bigger nightmare at the time described in A Journey in Service. Let us take our minds back, if we may, to the world in which General Ibrahim Babangida came to the leadership of Nigeria in the era of the two power blocs that operated and tried to dominate the world. In our part of the world, the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union and its ideological adherents, appropriated, quote, the progressive, unquote, tag, and tried to win hearts and minds and convince governments and populations that nations stood a better chance of rapid development by following the socialist path. Then there was the capitalist Western Bloc, led by America and its ideology, and not upsetting the people whose support is required to be able to make critical changes. I do believe most sincerely, though, that the mechanism should err on the side of greater, not lesser freedom. Because like Thomas Jefferson and J.B. Danquah, the founder of Ghana's liberal democratic tradition, I hold that enlarging the liberty of the individual within the rule of law has to be the true goal of public policy. Considering the breadth of the subjects and period of time covered in this book, I have no doubt that all of us who read it would have our favorite moments and maybe our disappointments or unanswered questions. I would gladly state that I am as confused about what is euphemistically called the June 12th saga today as I was 33 years ago. I'm in awe of the unarmed young Colonel Babangida as he walks up to the coup maker, Lieutenant Colonel Dimka, at Radio House in Ikoyi to talk him out of his doomed venture. I pointed out at the beginning of my speech that the general himself had said that it had taken more than 3 decades for him finally to bring out this book of his memoirs. According to an interview he granted Tell magazine back in 1995, which is reproduced as Appendix 2, the general told the magazine he was, quote, already working on the memoirs. I am not trying to build up defenses for whenever my memoirs would emerge. At almost 81 years, I obviously do not have 30 years to weigh up how I tell my story before I publish my memoirs. My story would obviously not have heart-stopping narratives of coming under enemy fire and being evacuated with shrapnel somewhere in my body. But my first term as president did coincide with the first certain President Trump's first term. Now that he's back in the White House and engineering another new world, maybe I'd have a bigger impetus to bring out my book quickly before the world is completely redrawn. There are 3 more matters of moment that I have to comment on briefly before I take my seat. The first relates to the spirited defense, as I choose to define it, of military intervention and governance that is given in the book, even though ultimately the author is resolute in his support of democratic government. The issue remains the same. Who confers legitimacy on government? Is it an enlightened elite, be it military, political, economic, or otherwise? Or is it the mass of ordinary people expressing their will freely through accepted procedures? It is the answer to these questions that prompted the greatest of British prime ministers, Winston Spencer Churchill, to say that, and I quote, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others," unquote. I'm happy, as I leave active politics in my country, that the Ghanaian people appear to have imbibed deeply democratic values and a democratic culture, to the extent that in the 33-year existence of Ghana's Fourth Republic, we have witnessed 4 peaceful transfers of power from one party to another through the ballot box in conditions that have not threatened the stability or unity of the state. It is a most comforting conclusion for someone who has devoted his life and energies to the advancement and entrenchment of democracy in his country, even though the last such transfer over a month ago, on 7th January 2025, was consequent upon a disastrous electoral performance by my party, then the ruling party, which led its presidential candidate to concede defeat even before the end of the formal collation and declaration of results. The silver lining in the party's dark clouds was that the vote was clearly the expression of the sovereign will of the Ghanaian people. May such expressions long continue. The second emanates from one of the most complex considerations confronting the development of the continent. The accumulation of capital, which enabled the Industrial Revolution to take place in the economies of the world, as well as of several of those in the East, occurred before universal adult suffrage was obtained in their countries. The Industrial Revolution in virtually all the countries of the world, of the West, United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and the others, preceded the achievement of universal adult suffrage. Indeed, women got the vote in the 20th century, long after the Industrial Revolution, just as blacks got the vote in the United States barely 60 years ago. our situation is different, even uniquely so. The democracies of Africa are attempting the structural transformation of their economies in conditions of governance that are underpinned by universal adult suffrage. It poses obvious problems in the social, political, economic, and moral spheres that to some extent explain the incoherences and tensions that characterize our present state of development. Our generation is required to find the tools that will enable us to resolve these incoherences and tensions. Finally, I cannot forego the chance of this prestigious platform to mount an important hobby horse of mine, and that is the appeal I've made before in this great country to the political and economic elite of the Federal Republic to take aggressively the leadership of West Africa and Africa's efforts to unite our nations and economies. Developments in the world indicate clearly the nature of the concentrations that are emerging in Europe, Asia, and the Americas in order to fortify and expand the possibilities of power and wealth available to them. We in Africa cannot afford to be left out of such a process. And for our prospects of effective integration to materialize, the Federal Republic of Nigeria has to assume her historic responsibilities and lead our development towards an integrated, democratic West Africa and Africa. That evolution cannot succeed without you, but you will be its greatest beneficiary. I'm aware that, like all the rest of us, you have significant problems of your own which require urgent attention. However, history cannot and does not wait. Means have to be devised which will enable us all to address with efficacy our contemporary challenges. You should know that in this march forward, you will have in Ghana